Hi, this is Dr. John again, and I'm going to give you the second part of the Mars Hill Science Philosophy, which we have entitled Equipping for Interaction with Non-Christians. We want to start with a quote from Augustine of Hippo. If they find a Christian mistaken in a field which they themselves know well and hear him maintaining his foolish opinions about our books, how they are going to believe those books in matters concerning the resurrection from the dead, the hope of eternal life, and the kingdom of heaven, when they think their pages are full of falsehoods on facts which they themselves have learnt from experience and the light of reason. The point of this quote is that if you sound like a fool in areas where the facts seem to be obvious to the casual observer or the casual scientist, then when you talk to them about other areas that require faith, they are going to think you're a fool, and they are going to see you as someone not to be trusted. And so, honestly, in many ways, the idea here is the idea that if you're credible in talking about scientific things, then it extends to a credibility beyond science. I remember one of my big pet peeves that Christians say is that the theory of evolution is just a theory. What they betray by that statement is the total lack of understanding of what it means to have a scientific theory. It is not to be interpreted in the same way that we interpret this term theory in other areas. And so what we hope to do, or the intent is to preserve our Christian faith and our Christian belief system, while at the same time being faithful to the scientific facts and the scientific understanding that we are learning. Now, I want to tell you a little story. I was listening to a tape one time, and it was an interview between a scientist and an interviewer who happened to be a Jew, a Christian, or a devout Jew. And the scientist basically said that he overheard a mother telling her daughter about rainbows. The daughter had asked, "Mama, where do rainbows come from?" And the mother said, "God made the rainbows." Now, this scientist tried to make the point that that this amounted to a soft form of child abuse, to tell a child that a rainbow was created by God. Now, what we need to understand is just because we can explain the fact that light comes through the water in the clouds, and that water refracts the light and separates it into its primary colors, and then we see those primary colors as a rainbow, just because we can give that explanation doesn't mean that God did not create the physical properties necessary to make that happen. And I want to continually emphasize the fact that just because you can explain a phenomenon in material terms doesn't mean that that phenomenon was not originally set up by God when he put the universe together. Now, one of the most important issues in our scientific program is to address the interaction between science and religion. This has become critical because over the past, I would say 50 or 60 years, maybe 70 years, culture has tried and has created a very sharp demarcation between science and religion. Stephen Jay Gould basically set up the situation as follows. He was an evolutionary scientist and atheist, and he said that the realms of science and the realms of religion were, quote, independent magisteria. Now, what he meant by that was the fact that these were two areas that had no impact on each other. This characterization reflects the general belief that things scientific and things religious do not interplay with each other, and that there's a sharp red line which has been drawn in the public arena and cannot be crossed. Specifically, the culture has judged the implications of any particular research or the motivations of that research to be, if they are affected by religion, then they do not or are not scientific. So for example, if in a course of study you find something that's judged to imply a religious conclusion, then it's not science, regardless of how you got there, regardless of the truth of the information. Or if you were motivated by a scientific motivation, then again, it's not science. The world viewpoint can be illustrated as follows. The figure on the left shows the way the culture looks at the interaction between science and religion regarding as far as implications and motivations. So neither the implications of the research or the motivations should be this judge or final arbiter of whether or not something is science in practice. When you use the implications or motivations, that is the origin of the practice that you're doing, when you use that to test the validity, it's a logical error called the Genesis fallacy. And what that means is that the origin of a claim, regardless of the truth of the claim, the origin of the claim either validates the claim or does not validate the claim. Now, for example, for many years, what was known as the Big Bang Theory, a negative term originally termed by a physicist named Hoyle, was rejected by many physicists because one of the implications of the Big Bang Theory is that it was a creation event. And since it was a creation event, it could not be science. Therefore, the implication of the Big Bang Theory, regardless of all the data that supported that theory, made it invalid. Now, showing some degree of hypocrisy, Richard Dawkins, a popular atheist, once stated that the theory of evolution allows me to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. In that quote, Dawkins clearly claims a religious, or in this case, anti-religious implication of the theory of evolution. Yet, no one would argue that the study of evolution is not science. Yet the same secular scientists will resist theories like intelligent design simply because they are either motivated by the foundational belief that there is a God or that there is a creator, or they imply that there must be an intelligence behind the created order. The science curriculum at Mars Hill takes exactly the opposite approach. And I have illustrated that on the right here as the fact that science and religion totally overlap. So in every area of scientific study, the conclusion of God as the creator and made the world the way it is drawn from an understanding of the revelation of God, the world, and sin. The motivation of a Christian scientist to understand how God put the world together is a beautiful thing and cannot be disavowed just because it implies God, and it does not mean that we are not studying science. So throughout the scientific study at Mars Hill, the importance of the context of the discovery in a world created by a loving and personal God is emphasized. And so I'll end this with the following story because it was so interesting to me at the time. I was at a meeting where we had brought together a bunch of pretty famous physicians in order to get their understanding in how to use one of our drugs and how one of our drugs works. Now, our drug worked in a fairly classic biochemical pathway that was discovered by one of the people we had at the meeting. He was a physician at a hospital in Nashville, and he had worked his whole life in this area and had fully described this biochemical pathway. And we were talking about this one time at dinner, and we said, someone said, boy, isn't it nice to have so-and-so here? He created the X pathway. And I was struck by the way he said that. He created the X pathway. In their mind, if you discover a pathway and explain the pathway, you've created it. I mean, it was not there before, and it's now there. And I couldn't help myself at the dinner. I said, he didn't create it. He just found it. And everybody looked at me and they were like beside themselves, and they didn't really fully understand what I was trying to say. But to me, it was obvious. God had created this pathway. It had always been there from the beginning of time, and we just came along and discovered it. And so I want you to understand that when we get into the classroom, what we're looking at is the discovery of things that God created.